The Constitutional Convention, Debate and Compromise. By the end of this video, you should be able to list ways that Americans were divided during the 1780s, describe the main parts of the Virginia and New Jersey plans, explain how the Great Compromise blended the Virginia and New Jersey plans together, describe other crucial decisions that were made through the debates at the Constitutional Convention, and define key vocabulary terms. In the 1780s, America was a divided country. Large states were divided against small states and felt like that they had different interests in the Congress. Northern states were divided against southern states. Along the lines of slavery, the northern states tended to be free or have very few slaves, and the southern states were much more dependent on slaves. But it was also economic in that the northern states tended to depend on trade more, and the southern states tended to depend on agriculture as a way to generate money. The wealthy versus the poor, educated versus the uneducated, and finally the urban versus the rural. The people who lived in towns tended to have more political say-so than people that lived in outlying regions more on the frontier. Each of these conflicts will play a role in the debates and compromises of the Constitutional Convention. Remember that the United States is based on representative democracy. The delegates who attended the convention in Philadelphia wanted to follow a Roman model for democratic government. And this basically means that they believed in three things. They believed that the wealthy, educated people were more fit to lead than the common masses, and you'll see examples in the Constitution of how they tried to safeguard against popular rule, which they felt like would lead to chaos. They also believed that sometimes people would have to sacrifice their own self-interest in order for the common good. And they believed that the preservation of liberty depended upon having leaders who were experienced and of strong character. In Philadelphia, 1787, when the convention convened, 12 of 13 states were represented. Rhode Island chose not to send any delegates to the convention. Over the course of the convention, there were 55 delegates in attendance, but only 39 of those people would wind up signing the Constitution at the end of the convention. James Madison served as the secretary of the convention and kept notes on all the speeches and debates. In fact, he missed almost nothing that happened at the Constitution. He's known as the father of the Constitution, and in keeping with the rule about secrecy at the convention, he only allowed his notes to be published on his death well after the convention had ended. George Washington presided over the convention. The first plan introduced is known as the Virginia Plan, and it represents the interest of the large states. It was written by Madison and presented by Edmund Randolph. It called for a bicameral or two-house legislature where representation would be based on the population of the states. The people in the state would elect members of the lower house to a 3-year term, and then the lower house would elect members to the upper house to a 7-year term. The national legislature would have more power than the states, and it would elect a president or an executive to administer and carry out laws. A national judiciary would be created with judges who were appointed, not elected, for life, and the people would ratify or make official this new plan of government. In contrast to the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, or the Small States Plan, was presented later. It was presented by William Paterson, and it called for a unicameral legislature, which is what the nation had under the Articles of Confederation, where every state would have equal representation, or 1 vote per state. It also gave the national legislature the power to tax and to regulate commerce or to control trade between the states and with foreign nations. And it called for the national legislature to elect an executive council, not just one president, but a small group of people who would serve a 4-year term. To blend these two plans, the Great Compromise was created by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It took the idea in the Virginia plan of a bicameral legislature, and it allowed the lower house to be based on population, but it kept with the plans for New Jersey for the upper house to be equal, and each state would get 2 representatives and therefore 2 votes in the upper house. It also called for slaves to be counted in the population as follows. 5 slaves living in a state would count as 3 people for the purpose of determining representation, and this was known as the 3/5 Compromise. It didn't give slaves any sorts of rights as citizens, but it counted them as part of a state's population when figuring out how many representatives they got in Congress. Some other important decisions that were made during the convention: the national legislature was given the power to regulate trade and tax imports, but not exports. So things leaving the country would not be subject to a tax, only those goods coming into the country from other places. They agreed that no law would be passed regulating the legality of importing slaves until 1808. This is called the Slave Trade Compromise. And they decided on an executive, a single president, who would be elected to 4-year terms in a 2-tier election. The people would cast popular votes for the president, and then electors would be chosen in each state to select the president and the vice president. We'll talk more about this system later. This is where the Electoral College originated. So, now that we've had our convention and the Constitution has been drafted, what's next? We'll take a more in-depth look at the 7 articles of the Constitution, and we'll analyze the debate over ratification, or making the Constitution legal, because remember, not even all the delegates supported the finished product. So what we're going to see is that support for the Constitution rested with a group of people who called themselves Federalists, while the Anti-Federalists opposed the document or wanted it changed in certain ways before it became law. That's the end of this video. Feel free to rewind or rewatch whatever parts you need in order to complete your notes.